Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this ITRC partnership seminar series. Especially, I would like to welcome Jane, and I could see, there are, co-researchers, co-authors who are also present here. So I would like to welcome Meena and Rob as well. And also, I would like to acknowledge the work of Simona and Francesco for on the basis of that, you are going to present the seminar. I believe I don't have to introduce Jane because most of you already know her. However, for those people who don't know Jane, Jane is a senior lecturer in international business articles. Not to mention, she has published various, articles, journal articles, book and book chapters. We are so pleased to have you, Jane, and we are eager to listen your insights about indigenous Australian indigenous entrepreneurs. So now it's your floor. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Raj. And thank you for introducing us. We do have two of our co-authors here, Meena, Chavan and Rob Jack, both from Macquarie University, and my colleague Simona from Deakin, she can't make it, and also Francesco is from Macquarie as well. So basically we did a study last year on Australian Indigenous female entrepreneurs, and we looked at, this kind of came out of the research in the sense that we used a qualitative inductive methodology. So we actually sort of found that, this what we call adversity quotient was quite strong in our data. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. But before I start, of course, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the custodians on the land in which we meet today, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I come from the beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country or Kabi Kabi country. So I just like to acknowledge those people. It's so nice to be here and engaging with those people there. And, if you know which country you're from, please feel free to pop into the chat what country you're coming from as well. So just to also acknowledge those peoples. So anyway, so what I wanted to do is just like contextualize our research, and Meena and Rob, feel free to jump in at any time. And, if people have questions along the way, I'm happy to answer them, but we'll also have question time at the end. So basically we started off with the underdog entrepreneurship literature, and I don't know if you've ever come across that literature ever before, and I know it sounds a bit derogatory. I always hated the term because it says underdog, but really this body of literature is looking at how our negative personal circumstances, whether it be economic, social, cultural or cognitive or physical, emotional, can actually play a very important role in getting people to be effective entrepreneurs. So if you read the article by Miller and Lee Breton Miller, they basically just talk about all of the different categories of people, whether it be someone who might be very poor and they came from China, they grew up in poverty, or whether it be that a person is disabled, or whether any sort of negative personal circumstance. And really what the article is arguing is that, how can we actually look at the adverse situation and how can this actually breed successful business activities? So in some ways we're trying to, bring it around and say, well, you might have grown up in an adverse situation, but how can you transform that to create a successful business? And so the article goes on and talks about things such as, coming from an adverse background might actually influence you to create adaptive requirements, which can help you with fostering work discipline. So, you might work harder, you might have more risk, or you might tolerate risk more, you might have more persistence, you might have social or better networking skills or creativity. And I'll just give you an example. So for example, if someone is disabled, they might develop really good social skills to be able to get people to help them to achieve the things that they need to achieve, such as opening a door, for example. So then, how can they use that kind of social networking skill to help them with their business at a later point in time? Okay, so really this underdog effect, and we've got the little yappy dog there, is basically saying, how can, the underdog effect is really just saying how we can, how an individual from this adverse background might be motivated to get out of their situation because they've got nothing to lose. Similarly, the weakest person's drive will help people put all efforts into win. And it might be that people, you know, who come from an underdog background might have a strong desire to change their current situation. Similarly, for our underdogs, we can also see that perhaps, you know, we've got this underdog observer effect, which basically means that if you see someone who is not doing so well, someone will always come and, or people will usually try and help those individuals. So here we've got all these factors that might actually assist those people in being successful with business. So just wanted to reflect on a couple of statistics that you might or might not know, you know, as of 2021, there was an estimated 881,000 Aboriginal people living in Australia, and this is actually expected to grow by 2031. So, you know, that's really positive kind of, you know, we can see greater numbers, we can see, you know, perhaps a flourishing of the Indigenous population here in Australia. However, we do see some gaps though. Recent data also suggests that only 51% of Indigenous women are in the workforce, and this is in comparison to non-Indigenous women in Australia, which is 65%. There's some other, you know, negative statistics, such as 71% of Indigenous women are likely to experience domestic violence in Australia as well. So there is quite a bit of literature. It's not too in-depth from the Australian perspective. I would say there's about 4 or 5 journal articles, Meena. There might be 6 from the Australian perspective, and we're doing that systematic literature review. Yeah, so okay, so really, you know, we've got some research by Paredes in 2006, and she was just really saying how, you know, Indigenous women's lives have been shaped and reshaped by the colonial influences, violence and abuse, removal of children, forced labour, genocide, relocation, prohibiting of speaking of Indigenous languages. And we can also see, you know, a whole range of racism, discrimination, and this further legacy of colonisation still occurring today, which, you know, might resultantly influence economic outcomes for Indigenous people. So we could make the strong argument that, you know, Australian Indigenous women do face strong adversity through, you know, the experiences that they've had and through colonisation over the years, and, you know, through racism, exclusion, etc. But, sorry, I haven't got to the positive yet. Also, our research may suggest that Indigenous women may lack human capital. So whether that's the education, you know, we're often at universities saying, how can we increase the amount of Indigenous women or Indigenous people who are actually studying? And, you know, that's always a bit of a struggle, but, you know, we need to be providing support networks to help assist that. Australian women, Indigenous women are likely to have a lack of access to financial capital, especially if, you know, financial capital is tied to home ownership or, you know, the ability to raise capital and so on. Similarly, there might be these geographical disadvantages as well. So if you're based in a rural or a regional location, there might also be that disadvantage. Okay, so despite this, and despite these challenges, there tends to be a flourishing, you know, business community, and what I've seen of Indigenous business people here in Australia, and whether that's supported by our government-funded bodies such as Indigenous Business Australia, or the various levels of chambers of commerce, such as the one in Victoria, which is Kinaway, or the South East Queensland Indigenous Chamber, where I'm currently based. I think there's one in New South Wales as well, Meena. Yes. Yeah. Okay, and then I guess even the Supply Nation thing, you know, these are all these kind of support networks. So some more recent research by Pearce, you know, found some positive stories about Indigenous women having these you know, agenic and engaging features. You know, they were demonstrating resilience, this survival, this perseverance, visionary resourcefulness, and so on. So I guess these are all types of underdog or traits that underdog entrepreneurs are likely to have. You know, it's this kind of survival, this perseverance, and so on. So that's where we kind of framed our study. And really, we kind of went into it without, going deeply into the literature. But what we wanted to do was really look at how does the context that Australian Indigenous First Nation entrepreneurs find themselves in help in explaining their success or not? And then how can this adversity quotient that I'm going to talk about, how can this explain their success as well? Okay, so what do? We went out, as I said before, we did a qualitative method and we used grounded theory. So basically in our grounded theory, we're sort of, stepping away from the literature. We're just going out and doing some interviews and discussions. So we did open-ended interviews or open-ended discussions with Indigenous women. And we actually got 18 of those that we spoke to. And we really just spent probably about an hour with them talking about their life story and, perhaps their previous work experience and also their current business and what they're currently doing. So we had a sample of 18, as I said before, and many of them had, very strong, or not always strong, but, a reasonably good corporate background or some kind of governmental role. A lot of our sample was based in major cities as well. So whether it was Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane, Perth, Darwin, and so on. We did have a couple of regional. So I guess we wanted to sort of say, well, that kind of influences the results. If they're from a, large city, they're coming from this corporate background themselves, and not all of them did, but quite a lot of them did. That kind of influences perhaps, or you might find different results if you went and interviewed people who might have come from these rural backgrounds or in Arnhem Land, etc. Okay, so another interesting things was that they were, a lot of these businesses were providing services or products that related to their Indigenous culture. And I'll talk about that more as well. We could also argue that many of these were what we call necessity entrepreneurs. So necessity basically means you had something happen to you that basically either prevented you from working or not wanting to work, or there was something in your life that kind of was a significant event that made them go, no, I'm not going to be working in this organisation anymore. I'm going off to start my own business. So, for instance, there was one female who experienced workplace bullying. There are others. One lady, her husband hurt her back. Hurt his back, so they had to start a business because, they wouldn't have had any other income, and so on and so on. So we used what we call the Goya method for data analysis, and this is basically a qualitative data analysis where we do what we call open coding or first order coding, and we basically, so I'm sitting there through the data. I think we had like 162,000 words in our text, which obviously is a lot to go through. And so it's really just doing this first order coding, what is everyone saying? Then it was categorizing it into the second order coding. And that's pretty much what I'm going to be reporting now, is what was the major kind of themes or findings that we had. And then we also used abductive methods. And basically through this abduction, what we do is we then start to look at the literature and say, how does our findings relate to the literature? How can we connect our findings with this literature to explain, what's going on in our findings? Okay, so we saw that a lot of this had a lot of similarity with this concept of adversity quotient, which I'm now going to explain. So basically, adversity quotient is a bit like IQ. So, we all know that IQ is like intelligence quotient, so how intelligent you are. We could also have EQ, which is like emotional intelligence. But our adversity quotient is really just looking at how the degree to which we can deal with an adverse situation. So it's sort of, and I always think about this like as a PhD student, right? Why can one do really well at it? and then another fail, and then just sort of go off and, no, I'm not doing my PhD anymore. And maybe it is because that person who was successful, they've got a very strong, kind of ability to deal with adverse situations. Doing your PhD is kind of adverse, difficult, hard to do those types of things. So similarly, perhaps this is what we saw in our data for these Australian First Nation entrepreneurs, females. Okay, so basically this adversity quotient has 4 different categories, which we call control, ownership, reach, and endurance. So really control is just looking at the degree to which a person can deal with an adverse situation. Ownership is the degree to which people will take control of the situation and look at improving their lives or improving what they're doing. Then we have reach, which is basically if you had a bad event happening to you, to what degree do you say, or to what degree does that bad event affect other parts of your life? So just say you had something really bad happen to you at work, does that then go and affect your personal life? Or vice versa, perhaps you got divorced at home and then, I don't know, that affects you at your work. So reach is the degree to which you can, section off those types of things. And the final aspect of this is endurance, which is really just looking at the duration of positive or negative events. So it's really just, was this adversity temporary or was it more long-term? And in actual fact, we probably found that a lot of the women that we interviewed had, long-term adversities that they'd experienced over their lives. So before I get deep into the nice qualitative findings, we also developed this model out of our findings. So this could actually go at the end, but I wanted to explain it now so that you have a bit of frame of reference about, why I'm talking about different things. So basically we find that, the women that we spoke to spoke about many of their different adversities that they'd experienced as an Indigenous person. Similarly, they also talked the adversities that they experienced as an Indigenous female. So that intersectionality of gender and race. Then what we argue is that this experience of adversity, so going back to our underdog literature, that basically this builds our adversity quotient. This is helping us to deal with further adverse situations. And as I said before, we have that control, the ownership, and the endurance and persistence. In actual fact, it was interesting because in our data, we didn't have the reach part of it, which I talked about before, but yeah, perhaps we could go back to our interviewees and just ask them about that. Okay, so then we would argue that this AQ, that if you have AQ, then this builds your capability to overcome business challenges. And then we found that these women had experienced business challenges or general business challenges. And this is really just any type of challenge that we might experience in business. So whether it's an Indigenous person or a non-Indigenous. And then we also found these Indigenous specific business challenges as well, which I'm going to talk about a bit later on. Okay, so overall, so if we've got this kind of adversity quotient, this helps us to overcome our challenges and it contributes to entrepreneurship success. So I'm going to talk about our qualitative findings. So we did, as I said, we did these 18 interviews. I feel like I can't represent everyone's discussions, because there was so much data. But we definitely found that, people talked about, coming from the stolen generation. And I don't know, that was, a consistent theme throughout our research. So here we've got one participant talking about her family going through forcible removals, for so many generations on her father's side and also on her mother's side. And then her saying, well, this is actually the first time that, I'm not from a stolen generation. Okay, so, there was also this, coming from that background of, whether family members engaged in substance abuse. So one participant talked about her father, even though she had a very great love for her father, and he had a very good career, he did, engage in substance abuse, which, many of, basically this person said many of their family did. The other finding here was that a lot of our participants, we did have participants who were Indigenous, but with white parents or non-Indigenous parents as well. So that was also a common theme. In actual fact, a lot of these people, even said that when I grew up, I didn't even know that I had an Indigenous background. And again, this was very sad for me. But one person said, I was always teased at school for being darker. And, later on, she actually learnt that she was from an Indigenous background when a lost family member had come searching for her. So obviously, these people had experienced that very strong intergenerational trauma. They also talked about lateral violence. And I talk more about that later on. So the lateral violence is really, if someone sees an Indigenous person being successful, another Indigenous person might, attack them because they're jealous or, they're, that sort of tall poppy syndrome, trying to cut them down. Okay, another person talked about how, we grew up in times when Indigenous people had no rights. We couldn't vote. We weren't allowed to live in particular areas, but that required us to be creative to get by. And again, this goes back to our kind of, like the underdog literature, which says that, if you're from an adverse background, you're building those creativity skills, which perhaps might have assisted this person with creating her business. Similarly, this person talked about, I don't know, we lived in government housing. My mum still lives in government housing. I really wanted to have my own home. So, so basically she wanted to work hard to be able to achieve that. And this person's a very successful person with a very successful recruitment business. So that's good to see. All right, so we definitely saw the intersectional adversities, this gender and race as well. And, a participant, expressed her lived experience of being bullied and harassed at her previous workplace. I can't remember whether it was from other Indigenous people, whether it was, anyway. So her key statement, I'll always remember this statement, was that Aboriginal women are always seen as the lowest common denominator in Australian society. Others reported of, intimidating and belittling experiences of trying to negotiate with male investors. So as this person said, I don't know, they were basically criticising her when they didn't, do, or when she didn't do what they wanted her to do. So that really kind of rocked her, really, it was a significant event by her. Okay, so there's lots of other examples, clients being put off that you're young and female and Indigenous, others, experiencing domestic violence in their previous relationships, which they subsequently escaped, breakups of marriages, being dragged through the court systems, being a single mother, having to juggle responsibilities of work and children and so on. Okay, so that's the negative, and now I wanted to kind of bring it around and say, well, okay, we acknowledge that. Let's look at how we can be successful. So a lot of our participants talked about controlling the situation, and there were plenty of examples where for instance, a very successful fashion entrepreneur, Indigenous fashion entrepreneur, basically said, I found it really difficult to work and take care of my young son. Her workplace, even though she had a really good corporate career, she just basically said at that point in time, I think it was in the 2000s or late 1990s, they just weren't open to supporting women. And the fact that she was also Aboriginal, she was like, I don't fit into any category here. So this really started her to think about starting her own business. And actually, she's had 3 businesses, 2 that she still owns, 1 very successful business that she also sold off. Another person talked about how she was an interior designer, she was working for a large Australian corporate organisation, and she just said from a sustainable perspective, their values didn't meet hers. Again, I think she was an individual who didn't actually know her for her Indigenous background, and then as she'd found that out, that kind of led her to start thinking about doing her own business that more met her cultural values and her values just in general around sustainability. Others talked about their bored life. We all can have boring lives, can't we? So she's sitting at a conference, writing on a business idea on her napkin. Another individual talked about, I have this dream of getting Indigenous people into executive positions, so I created a business to try and achieve that, even though she said, I have no idea how to do recruitment. So she was really, really good for that. Okay, and then another individual just talked about how, establishing my business really helped with me with my depression. And that person had experienced domestic violence and other issues, having children young and so on. So we also found, this kind of ownership. So, really trying to working your way out of a situation when you're tricky. When it's tricky, you might have that fear of failure. It might be debilitating, but you've got to get comfortable with that. Or another one talked about, you've got to seize these opportunities. This person, she's an entrepreneur. She does entrepreneurship programs in Northern Territory, very well known. And she's basically like, people are offering me these opportunities and I have no idea about them, but I just accept the opportunity. And then, as she says, I just go and Google the shit out of it and, make it successful. Okay, so others just talked about, the need to be ambitious, assured, building their skills, their agency, their entrepreneurial capability and education, and just really taking this ownership. So we also, found this kind of duration or this endurance, this duration of adversity that the core model also talks about. And basically, one participant talked about how, her family members, when she was younger, were placed into a mission boarding house. And she goes, we used to walk for days to go and see that person. So again, in my mind, that, demonstrates a resilience and, like kind of endurance to try and achieve those things, which then could be used at a later point in time. Others talked about, I keep on working, even I get rejected. I've got lots of struggles in my personal life, but we keep on persisting, and where we persist, we achieve. And others talking about, you stumble, you fall, but, just as long as you keep on picking yourself up. Okay, so we have this argument that, these women do have adversity quotient. They've had all these experiences through their lives. There's many other stories, many other deeper stories in our interview data. But, I'm a strong opinion that that's there. So what are the types of business challenges that the women were talking about? A lot of them talked about money type of issues, whether it's a cash flow problem. Again, I would suggest this is just a general business problem. Small to medium enterprises, whether you're Indigenous or not Indigenous, might experience, having big corporates taking 90 days to pay your invoice. The creative interior design participant said, I'm not a money person, or I'm an artist, I'm just trying to get by, pay the bills and those types of things, but I don't really know what's going on. Others said, I naively thought that I knew about business, but I don't. Others talked about how, I think there's this one woman, I think she lost her job, and then she was like, what am I going to do now? And so in the end, she said, okay, I'm going to try and get this business up and running. I'm going to give myself 6 months. And luckily she, landed her first contract to do a community assessment. Others talked about, getting ripped off. We can all get ripped off in a business deal. So those were some of the business challenges that they'd faced. We also asked, is there anything, I think we're just talking about business challenges in general, but, they also talked about these Indigenous issues. So I don't know if you've come across this term before, but the first one is black cladding. So basically black cladding is when non-Indigenous people or white people start a business but get an Indigenous person to be the leader of that organisation so that they can access funding from the government, or, maybe be seen as kind of, someone that you want to deal with. So a lot of that was reported by our participants. There was also this broken Indigenous procurement policy. And again, I don't know if you know about that, but basically the federal government have a policy that says that for government services, they need to get so many Indigenous businesses to provide a quotation or a tender for it. And basically, a lot of the experiences of the women that we spoke to, they just said, that the government asked us to do this. We spend all of our time, and don't forget, a lot of these people were small to medium enterprises. We spend our time doing the tender, and the government are just ticking their box and they don't use us in the end. So one person just basically said, I refuse to do that anymore. You know, I'm not wasting my time on that crap. So, you know, in their kind of opinion, this was a broken Indigenous procurement policy, and that needs to be fixed. So we also found that lateral violence, and especially for female businesses which were successful. So I think a couple of people had experienced, you know, what are you doing? You post on social media too much, you're promoting yourself too much, you know, or another just talked about how, because my business is successful, everyone in this group hates me, those types of things. Others, one of the businesses in Western Australia basically said when the Supply Nation policy came out, she goes, okay, I'm going to go register my business, even though her business wasn't Indigenous as such, because it was an engineering business. She basically said, after I registered on Supply Nation, there was a 20% drop in her revenue because of her impression was that white businesses didn't want to be associated with Indigenous business. So hence this racism and this exclusion of Indigenous people from the Australian business community. Right, so that many examples of successful businesses, you know, businesses that, you know, if you go and investigate, you would just go, wow, I can't believe they're doing that. So Chirico being one, you know, Indigenous fashion, they're often off in Europe, you know, on fashion runways and so on, you know, just demonstrating their fashion. They're very strong into sustainability as well. I just noticed yesterday they were doing something where now you can actually go and rent their clothing because their clothes are quite expensive. They're very beautiful. Then I don't know, artists training for Australian organisations who want to, you know, build up their Indigenous capability, or even, you know, some food type of businesses. So as I said before, a lot of these businesses or key features started by women who often had strong corporate or government backgrounds. So I think that was really important because that kind of meant that, you know, if you have that corporate background, you've got that human capital, you can then apply it to your, you know, business venture. And a lot of them talked about their great support networks within their communities and so on. And this is what we're exploring in our next paper, isn't it, Meena? You know, the relationships and righteousness and so on. We had a range of older females entrepreneurs, so people who had a lot of experience, but also some younger ones, you know, maybe in the late 20s, early 30s, and some in between as well. So it was good to see, you know, this kind of, you know, range of different ages and different things that they were doing. And even if we had an older female entrepreneur, she was still doing, you know, more modern things like, you know, fashion and digital and all of those types of things. So some of these are very successful, or I guess all the people that we did interview were pretty much successful. And again, maybe that's another limitation of our research that perhaps we could look at unsuccessful businesses. As I said before, all had a very strong connection with Indigenous culture, whether it was fashion, whether it was art, movie making. There were quite a few recruitment businesses for Indigenous services or Indigenous people. And that was interesting because, you know, that's that very kind of righteous notion. You know, they were trying to do that. So, you know, we want to get more Indigenous people into executive leadership positions, or I'm in Darwin and I recruit Indigenous people and I seek to try and change their lives around so that, you know, they're not dependent on welfare anymore. Indigenous training for Australian organisations, food, entrepreneurship programs. There are also these organisations that were, you know, providing these reconciliation action plans or community services. We did have a couple of firms that were just providing just normal, you know, accounting services, for example. But we found a very strong, you know, theme that was that, yeah, they were providing this Indigenous type of service. So we basically make the argument that they overcome a lot of their challenges using their adversity quotient, and this adversity quotient comes from, or they develop that from their previous background. So just as some conclusions, what were some of these practical recommendations that were made? So again, we asked our participants about what do you think we should be doing, or what do you think anyone should be doing to help more Australian Indigenous females be entrepreneurs? And there was a very strong thought around, entrepreneurial training for young people at school, whether it's, in primary school or in their early teenage years, because often we're not taught that at school. I think more nowadays we are, more so, but not when I went to school. Definitely not. I'd also make the suggestion that, perhaps we need training to help build women, these Indigenous women's AQ. So perhaps, how can we build their capability to control a situation, and really just reflecting on what is control, what is this ownership, what is this resilience and endurance, and not allowing negative events to impact them. Even though there already is existence of some Indigenous women's groups, so there was an Indigenous women's group with IBA, even the Chambers of Commerce, they've got some mentoring and support networks. So we're seeing a bit of that. And there's an example there of ABC News reporting on a, women's only Australian conference. So perhaps, further promoting that and building that up might, influence success. We'd also suggest that giving better financing options from banks or corporates and governments, especially for women who do not have assets and don't have houses to get loans or to use that as collateral. And I guess this is especially important, especially if, a female has gone through a divorce, maybe they've lost their house or their half of their house or whatever that they had. Again, building up this financial literacy, I think this is we already know this, but, again, this sort of came out in our study. But also I think, having this widespread program of engaging mainstream communities and businesses and just showing the strengths and the, just these amazing businesses that we interviewed. There were so many good ones that you're just like, wow, I didn't even know they existed. So how can we further promote that? In actual fact, in some ways, in our research, that's what we're seeking to do. We've got a book that we're currently writing on this as well. And, through our journal articles, we'll do that too. And then just our final conclusion is, how can we all learn from Indigenous businesses to be more socially orientated, sustainable, and to care about others? And so I guess that was another major theme, was that, the fashion entrepreneur, she just really talked about, I can't, I redistribute my profits back to the designers who do the design work for me. I can't make a profit off these people. That's horrible, And so, you could just see in her business, she was very socially orientated.